Welcome to Radical Personal Finance, a show dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, skills, insight, and encouragement you need to live a rich and meaningful life now while building a plan for financial freedom in 10 years or less. My name is Joshua Sheets. I'm your host, and today I want to share with you some lessons that I have been learning. Now, as the years go by, as I get older, my ambition is that I am acquiring more wisdom. That is my goal, is to become a wise elder of society. And so, since that is my ambition, I believe that it's useful and valuable to try to pay attention to the lessons that I am learning. And there is a philosophy that I have developed that is a complete and total repudiation of how I used to live in my youth. And as the years go by, I find myself more and more embracing this philosophy and seeking to distance myself further from the way that I behaved in the past. And just today, I was reminded afresh of how important this is. Now, I describe this philosophy in my own words in this manner. I say, it's always cheaper to feed the meter than to pay the ticket. It's always cheaper to feed the meter than to pay the ticket. Now, I've discussed this one other time on the podcast, but I want to do a little reprise discussion here because I believe this is such a fundamental, foundational habit of life. In my youth, in my arrogant and I don't know what to say other than arrogant youth, I thought I was big stuff. And I thought that I could manipulate the reality of the world in whatever direction I wanted it to go. Now, to be fair, that opinion and perspective was not without some evidence. There were many times in my life in which I was able to get results out of life that other people were not able to get. I grew up with a good deal of personal privilege due primarily probably to simply being tall. Since I've always been tall throughout my life, I've always been treated in a different way than many other people just due to being fairly large. I was never bullied. No one ever picked on me just because I've always been taller than most people. In third grade, when all the students' desks were lined up, you got to my desk and all of a sudden, boom, it's 4 inches higher than the entire line of desks lined up side by side than everybody else's. And so for whatever reason, I adopted that basic idea when I was younger. And I got used to the idea that it was fun to try to break rules. I got used to the idea that, it's life is more interesting if you try to get special treatment in some way. And there were many times in life when I was younger when I was able to get special treatment, when I was able to get into places that everybody else couldn't get into, when I was able to get invitations to stuff that nobody else could do, and I was able to do things that other people didn't do. And some of those things were, I hesitate to say illegal. I'm sure some of them were, but I wasn't much of an illegal person. But I broke some rules, and then some of them were just thinking creatively. I've always had an ambition to live large in the sense that what's the point of living in a boring way? I'd like to live an interesting life. And so I've just done things that a lot of people didn't do. And none of them were particularly problematic, but I did things that other people didn't do. I'll share just a funny example, a story of that. Number of years ago, when I was in college, I went on a study abroad program. And when I was on the study abroad program, like most students, we came in and the expectation of the study abroad program was that students are going to be living with their host families. They're going to be going places with their host families. We were allowed to travel. There were no rules against our traveling. And so we were allowed to travel. But the basic assumption was if we were going to travel, we'd jump on a bus and we'd use the public transportation. Well, I came along and I said, hey, well, here we are in a foreign country. Let's just go ahead and rent a car. Doesn't matter that we're, 19, 20 years old. There's no law against us renting a car. Just have to pay extra money. So a couple times on those events, I rented a car and wound up traveling with this rented car and having a great time all over the country with my friends for a really fun weekend. Well, the only problem was that in renting the car, we ran into some trouble. The first time, my car was robbed. All our passports were stolen. All our stuff was stolen from the car, and that was unfortunate. And the second time I rented a car, I never told anybody. this at the time, but I wound up in an accident. Everyone was okay, but I wound up totaling the car and had to get a replacement car. And a couple years later, I came back and I was visiting with I handled it all myself. And then a couple years later, I came back and I was visiting with the study abroad staff. And I said, hey, I'll tell you a funny story. And I went ahead and told them the story of the accident. Well, that was when I found out, when I was visiting with the teachers and professors, that after I had rented the car and had all my stuff stolen, which they did know about, they had changed the policy for me, because of me and my dumb actions, and they'd made it against the policy for students to rent cars. So that's an example of kind of how I lived when I was younger. And I took this as a natural sign of like the intelligent way to live. Why would I sit back there and coach class with those suckers when I can walk up to the counter and say, hey, listen, I'm 6.5 feet tall. Could I have an exit row? Or, hey, listen, you have any spaces open in first class? I'll be that weird 20-something who flies in a suit and tie and see if maybe they upgrade you. And it used to work. But as I got older, I discovered that it worked less and less. And it wasn't until a few years ago where I started to realize how destructive that basic ideology had been in my life. Because you see, it wasn't just limited to, well, I can get us into the club underage because we're just coming in to dance. We're not coming to drink, and so that's fine. And after all, I'm big and tall, and they won't mind. And I'll slip the bartender a 20, and we'll go in. Or the bouncer a 20, and we'll get in. Or, it wasn't just because I was in a position where, well, they'll give me the exit row because I can use it. But that naturally extended itself to the idea of taking advantage of all of the hacks of life to get ahead. So when I was in college, I most strikingly remember picking up the 4-hour work week before it was popular. And that happened because one of the places I hung out all the time in college was Barnes & Noble. There was a Barnes & Noble right near my school, and they had comfortable chairs. And so I would just go there many times for hours in the afternoon, browse all the books, read a dozen books or so, take 1 or 2 home and enjoy those. So I was very familiar with the releases at that time. And so I picked up the 4-hour work week right immediately when it was available for sale, before it became popular. And I thought, man, Tim Ferriss, here's somebody who has my philosophy. Here's this guy who knows how to exploit the rules. At the time, he opened the book with a story of how he had gone in, I think, to a judo competition. He opened with a discussion of Latin tango dancing and how he was able to become a competitive tango dancer in a few months. And then he talked about this, I believe, some kind of judo competition that he won by exploiting the rules and finding some kind of loophole. And that was the basic theme of the book, was here is how a smart guy can exploit all the rules and find a loophole. And here's how you can get ahead. And here's how you can live like a millionaire without being a millionaire. Here's how you can do all these things. And this was the period of Lifehacker. Was a big website, and this philosophy of hacking everything became really popular. Well, I pursued that philosophy, and I always thought, well, this is the smart way to do it. After all, if you want to fly first class, then the way to do it is accumulate credit card points and find a loophole, and that's how you fly first class. Or if you want to go and get ahead, you exploit some little inside path, and then you get ahead fast. That's the way to do it. But friends, I've learned as life has gone on that, quite simply, that is not the way to do it. That pathway leads to some perception of short-term good results, but it doesn't lead to good long-term results. And if you wind up pursuing that pathway, you're always a step behind and a minute too late. And I think that this philosophy is kind of a modern expression of the aphorism that we have of penny wise and pound foolish. Now, when I talk about it's cheaper to feed the meter than to pay the ticket, that's where I first started recognizing how erroneous that philosophy was in my mind. So if you can imagine kind of an arrogant young guy who thinks he can find loopholes and who knows all the back corners of his city, well, you can imagine that kind of guy would probably not like paying parking meters. So you can imagine that guy would go to a festival and he would know the street that you could park on for free. And that guy would go and, well, I'm just going to run in for 20 minutes. It's probably not going to work out. Or it's probably not going to, the meter's probably not going to get checked during that time, and they'll probably be okay. And I remember one time I went into a meeting with someone when I was a financial advisor, and I forget why I didn't put more time in the meter, but I just put the bare minimum time in the meter. And then I come out a while later and there was a ticket. And so I was over in Palm Beach. So I went up to the office and I paid my ticket, and it wasn't a big deal. But as I was paying this dumb $20 parking ticket, I thought to myself, that was really stupid. Here I am paying $20 when I could have just paid $1 and fed the meter. And these odds don't seem to be in my favor. If the small number of times I feed the meter, if I just put in an extra $1 and have extra time, I'll never have these tickets. And this $20 ticket is really annoying, not only from the perspective of the $20, that's not a big deal, but it's really annoying from the perspective of the time required for me to go and pay this ticket. And that was where that formulation first occurred. And I decided to change. And that was probably 15 years ago, I decided to change. And over the years, I have continued to change in that direction. Now, I'm not the paragon that I would like to be in this area still, but more and more I just see how foolish I was in my youth to adopt that hacker lifestyle. And I recognize that while you might get good short-term results from that, over the long term, the person who just simply does the work, the person who feeds the meter, the person who is proactive, that is the person who gets good long-term results. My family and I are in the process of a big international move. And as we were leaving, I needed to go and get this morning I went to government office to get some copies of my children's birth certificates apostilled. And for our big international move. If you've never moved internationally, there's a thing called an apostille that is a product of, I think, the Hague Convention in 1964. And it's basically a way that governments legalize documents so that they can be recognized internationally. So if you're living in the United States and you're born in the state of Georgia and you move to Alabama, you can just go and present your Georgia birth certificate whenever you need to do work, and it's all the same. But if you move from Georgia, USA to the Georgia, the nation, then how does the Georgia nation know that your Georgian birth certificate is legitimate? Well, the way they do that is there's a process called an apostille. So you send your birth certificates off to the state authorities, and they formalize and legalize and add some extra stamps and ribbons and seals and say, yep, this all is correct, and we hereby certify that this is correct. That's what an apostille is. So I was going and getting some birth certificates apostilled. And I got to the office, and I discovered that I was trying to have more birth certificates apostilled than they would do, and so they were going to wait, and it's not going to work out. I'm not going to get them in time, and all of that. And so, I was struck because my instinct in that situation is to play the demanding American. I'm not bad at that. I can do that when I need to. So I play the demanding American and talk about how this should be right and I should make this work. And that's actually a role that I don't think is totally without value. I put that role on occasion because it's quite useful. Americans have this cultural idea that I think is actually a positive thing, that somehow we can bend the fabric of reality in the direction that we want it to go. And that just comes from something that we imbibe from our culture, from the broad success of our forebears and the culture that we grew up in. And so we tend to think that we can have the world to be the way we want it to be. And there are occasions in which that particular cultural expression is quite useful. But then there are many occasions in which you wind up just being a jerk and you wind up being super annoying. That person is going on and on and on about how I have all these other things that need to be done, and you're the guy just screaming and shouting at someone who can't actually do anything for you because her boss says no. So it's a kind of a persona that I can turn on when I need it, but most of the time I look at it and say that's not particularly useful. And in this situation, I was quite happy because I didn't need the copies of the birth certificate apostille. I already have a stack of them done. I was just being extra proactive and getting more of them in case I need them in the future. And when I did that, I realized that this was a combination of two things. Number one, because I was proactive, I was not without the things that I needed. But for me, it was an experience where the government agent saying no was just simply a minor inconvenience, not anything significant. Nothing in my life is messed up by that because I have learned to be proactive and I have learned to feed the meter rather than to just say, well, I'll figure it out and pay the ticket. I'm not perfect in it, right? The good thing would have been a month ago to go and get these extra things, but that's all right. It didn't work out that way. So it would have been smart for me to go and do that. But I didn't do it then. But it's a minor inconvenience because I have been proactive. And what I want to tell you with all these anecdotes is simply that it pays to be proactive. If you remember Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, if my memory is correct, I believe the first one is being proactive, which means you take responsibility for everything. And you recognize that I've got to be ahead of the game. I don't need to be in the situation where I'm kind of scrambling around. And because I travel so much, I'll give just another example. Like this comes down to passports. When you travel a lot, you realize this one little document is the document that sets the pace of my life. Everything depends on this document. And over the years, I have helped with so many people with passport issues. Because what'll happen is someone says, oh, I've got this great invitation for a trip. And yet, oh man, my passport is about to expire or it's expired. And how can I get a rush passport? And I have had to do this myself. I forget the circumstances a number of years ago. I needed to get a passport. And so you're calling the emergency rush passport line where you can walk into the office and get it same day service, but you have to have a flight scheduled and you have to call them and you have to go to some other city to do this thing. And the simplicity of a passport that you pay $160 or $200 for, and you have it long before you need it, turns into this last minute just nightmare of a situation where it winds up costing you $1,000. And so like these things matter. And so with a passport, it's fairly simple. An adult passport lasts for 10 years. So it's a little more annoying with the children's passports, but you can just renew them early, 2 years early or something like that. So your passport lasts for 8 years and your child's passport, you renew it every 3 years. And then you're never in that last minute thing. Now that's expensive, it seems. But in the grand scheme of life, it's actually a very small expense. It's a small expense. And if you don't pay the small expense when it's easy, then it becomes much more difficult down the road. Now let's turn to life. So these are just, okay, Joshua, that's an amusing anecdote. But let's turn to life. When's the best time to get an education? As early as possible. This is over the years I've thought. I used to do these shows about how radical thinking to don't get a college degree. You can just skip a college degree, and I thought at the time I still think my analysis was sound. But what has happened over the years is that now what used to be the non-mainstream opinion at that time has now become more of an increasingly. It's not mainstream, but it is increasingly mainstream. That's a fair category. That's a fair categorization. It's increasingly a mainstream opinion to say, oh, well, you don't need a college degree. Now I find myself on the other side saying, yeah, you do. Like getting a college degree when you're 18 years old is actually super easy. It's not difficult, and you should go and do it because you're going to wake up when you're 30 years old and you're going to really wish you had it. I'm really glad I have a bachelor's degree. I'm really glad to have a master's degree. I really wish I had a PhD. Would have been easier when I was younger to feed the meter and go ahead and finish a PhD, but I didn't. I had the chance, but I didn't. Could have done it. They offered me at the American College, they offered me a fellowship working with the, they didn't offer it to me formally. They offered me to consider it. And at the time, I think I could have done it, but they offered me and said, hey, come and do a fellowship with us and start working on a PhD. And at the time, I could have done it, and I should have done it. Even if I didn't need it, I should have done it. I should have fed the meter. Because when you're early in life, it's easier to feed the meter. And then for the rest of your life, you have these credentials that open doors for you. And that's extremely useful. And down the road, when you wake up and you're 40 years old and you want to have a PhD, now you got to pay the ticket. And it's much more disruptive. Looking at other things with regard to business, developing the skills. If you're young and you're getting started in a career, make it your aim to be world-class on the fundamentals. Be proactive about genuinely being an expert, genuinely being world-class. Because the day will come in which you don't have the time to become an expert. But if you'd invested the time early in your life, early in your career, early in your new job, and you learned all the fundamentals, that'll pay off down the road. But if you just say, well, I'll just hack it, I'll just make it up, I'll do something, I'm good at thinking off the cuff, then you will wish it doesn't work out so well. I say that, by the way, as somebody who is very, very good at thinking off the cuff. A decade ago, I did a Kolbe profile, and that's one of the psychological profiles that I really like. And in Kolbe profiles, at the time, I assume it's still the same, but they had this thing called Quick Start. And I forget the rating, I think it's 10, but I'm a very high Quick Start. And so what that means is that I like to think on my feet. It's actually when my brain comes alive. I get kind of bored preparing for stuff in advance. But just because I like doing that doesn't mean that the preparation doesn't pay off. And when you, again, personality type, when you're good at thinking on your feet, it's easy to say, well, I'll figure it out. And I've got a long life history of figuring it out. But figuring it out works best when you have really invested the time up front to be proactive long in advance. I no longer look for hacks. I'm not interested in hacks. That's not to say that a particular action may not be, intelligent, right? If you need to spend $10,000 on something that you can swipe a credit card for, is there any harm in you going and taking a $150,000 welcome bonus and getting 150,000 points for the $10,000 you were going to spend anyway, and then going ahead and having that $150,000 pay for 4 tickets for your family vacation? I don't think there's any harm in it. Of course not. That's just, okay, here's an opportunity. I'll go ahead and collect these points and we'll take the trip. But the problem is that kind of thinking becomes a distraction. If you recall, this is the basic argument I gave when I talked about credit card points. There's nothing wrong with the credit card points, but when you chase the credit card points, what you give up on is you give up on the better, higher use of the time. And so what I now see in my own life, as I've reflected quite a lot over the last couple of years, trying to figure out the direction of my life, what I now see in my own life is that if I had been more committed to the hard work in my teens and in my 20s, rather than pursuing the hacks and enjoying my quick wins, I would be far ahead now because of the real foundation. One more just area of life as an example. I watched this really great series recently on Special Forces boot camp selection. And I forget the name of the title, but they did a really good job. And this was a bunch of guys who were going and trying out for the Special Forces, but it was open tryouts. So none of them were coming. A few of them were in other places in the military, but they weren't coming in the slow path. It was just open anybody who can cut it and who can perform things. And as I was watching the training, I was reflecting on those who were succeeding and those who were failing. And those who were succeeding those who were having a hard time, they were asked, how long have you been training for this? And the guy would say, 8 weeks. I've been training for this for 8 weeks. And on the one hand, you could say, well, that's great. At least he's training for something and he's come in and he's got 8 weeks of training and he's going after this thing. And so good for him. There's nothing wrong with doing a tryout after 8 weeks. But the guy was falling behind in all the physical endurance tests. Meanwhile, there were other guys who were coming in and who were doing very well. And they had not only been training for years, but they had had an active lifestyle for many years before that. And so just imagine the difference if you're going to pass through this course, this difficult, rigorous course, if you already are in the habit of running and doing push-ups and pull-ups, and that's just part of your lifestyle, and you've done that for a decade, then all of a sudden you wake up at 30 years old and you say, you know what, I'm going to apply for Special Forces selection, so let me go ahead and put in 3 months of hard work. Well, that guy is so much further ahead than the guy who's a couch potato and wakes up and says, I'm going to do 3 months of hard work. You're not going to get it done. And so what's fascinating about life is proactivity. The earlier you can start to be proactive, and the more proactive you can be in every aspect of life, the better your long-term success. So in order to succeed in life, you've got to do the things that need to be done long before you need to do them. And that's what separates the winners from the losers over the long term. I read a quote that I really loved recently. I don't recall where it is. But the Chase Hughes was who it was attributed to. I don't know who that is. But he said, discipline is when, in the moment, you are placing your future self's needs ahead of your own. That means that the benefit to you in the future is more important than the reward in the present. He also said, most of our failures and problems in our lives we can attribute to the neglect of our future self. Discipline is when, in the moment, you're placing your future self's needs ahead of your own. Now, here's what is remarkable to me. I used to think that it was more exciting to kind of figure things out, right? It's much more exciting to speed and best the cop in an altercation than it is to leave 10 minutes early so I can drive the speed limit. So the excitement is one of the things that gets people there. But that excitement winds up sabotaging other areas of your life. Whereas if you're 10 minutes early for the appointment, and you're calm and you're collected, and you're focusing on the excitement of the appointment, it can pay off. So cultivate the habit of proactivity, cultivate discipline so that you're placing your future self's needs ahead of your own. Do the things that you know to do when they should be done, and over time, you will get much bigger results. One more comment I want to pull in for a moment. I've been pondering this for a couple of years. How do we figure out how to tell healthy stories about mundane successes when it's so easy to tell the stories of the unique wins and then they become normalized for people? So I first started thinking about this years ago with regard to when people would ask for, like in the Christian world, right? So I'm part of the Christian world, the Christian religious subculture. And in the Christian world, one of the things that is really enjoyable about the Christian world is that we have millions and millions of testimonies throughout history of really unique people who have converted to Christianity and whose lives have been changed by the truth of the Christian gospel. And we love to hear these stories. And so if you're part of the Christian subculture, as I am and have been my whole life, you really enjoy hearing these stories, right? Here comes this axe murderer who murdered 27 people. And then finally, when something happened, that he finally bowed his knees and he realized his sin, and God saved him and he's totally transformed. And of course, he's still going to be hanged, but that's fine. That's what he should be. But here's an amazing story. Or some guy will come in and say, I spent years chasing wine, women, and song, and I totally wasted my life, but then I met Jesus and now everything is better. Well, the problem is that it's fun to hear those stories and they're pretty cool. But when you grow up in Christianity and you kind of just do the right thing, or what you're told is the right thing, you don't wind up with a trail of brokenness behind you. I've never in my life left a trail of brokenness behind me. I haven't left a string of broken hearts. I haven't left a bad reputation. I have a stellar credit report. I've never gotten arrested for debauchery. So you start to think when people say, what's your testimony? You're like, well, I've just kind of gone along and done what I was supposed to do. And here I have a pretty easy life and everything's great. It sounds kind of wimpy. It sounds kind of like a dumb testimony. But in reality, that's what you want, right? And I'm not here talking about the fact. I'm not saying the idea that doing the right thing changes your heart fundamentally. But what I'm saying is that when you do the right thing and you live the right way, you wind up with a really relatively easy life, and that is actually fantastic. I have a really easy life. I have a really easy marriage because my wife and I are simple, normal people who are well-adjusted to each other. We don't fight. We don't argue. Everything is super easy and super, super simple. My life is relatively easy and low stress. Everything about my life is really good and really enjoyable. It just sounds really wimpy to say that out loud when in reality we were attracted to the stories of catastrophe on all sides. And what I learned as I've gotten older and have served as a father to my own children is I need to be careful about the stories that I tell them. Because if I spend all my time telling them stories of unusual success through unusual circumstances, they start to think that that is normal. They start to think that that is the expectation. Last night I watched a story of this amazing, I forgot the guy's name, but this amazing Australian sheep farmer who years ago, there was an ultra marathon scheduled from Sydney to Melbourne in Australia. Very long ultra marathon. And this sheep farmer, his last name was Young, maybe Jeff Young, I can't remember. But this sheep farmer comes in and decides, I'm going to join the race. And so he's there with all these professional athletes who have been long-distance runners and training for a really long time. And he comes into the race, and he comes in wearing a pair of blue jeans and an old pair of sneakers, and he's spent his whole life chasing sheep all over a hillside, and he comes in and he enters this race. Well, as you might imagine, or I wouldn't be telling the story, he wins it. Not only does he win it, but he blows the record out of the water. And he blows away all of these professional athletes. And so here he is as this sheep farmer who has won the race. And we love to tell the story because it's so improbable. How on earth does this old man sheep farmer win this race when all these professional athletes who have trained and trained and trained for years aren't winning it? And they're doing much worse than him. Well, that doesn't mean... So what's easy to think from that, if you are not thinking carefully, is that, well, training doesn't matter. After all, here were all of these athletes, and their training doesn't matter at all. That's not the lesson. It's not like sitting around and not training for a race means that you'll do better in the race than someone else. Now, as it turns out, I believe that this man, in his own unique way, running around sheep wearing a pair of running around after sheep wearing a pair of heavy boots, he had figured out a running technique which is now imitated by many long distance runners. But and so that was great and that was unique, and he had unique insight from his experience. So I guess there's two lessons that we want to draw. Lesson number one is listen to everybody. Think about people's experience, because people might have a different unique perspective and have something to share. But don't think that not preparing is the pathway to success. On the contrary, if you know there's something that could be done and should be done, you should do it. So we need to be careful about constantly telling stories about the sheep farmer who wins the running race, or the guy who walks into the football practice and does it, or the people who just out of the blue wind up being shot to success. Because when we just tell those stories, we wind up negating the experiences of the vast majority of people. And this ties back to what I was saying earlier about things like college. You can make a really good, solid argument that it's not necessary to have a college degree, to live a happy, adjusted life where you earn a good amount of money. Obviously, you can make a good argument. But that's the exception, not the norm. And what happens is we wind up profiling the exception, and it's easy for us to miss the underlying lesson. Well, Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard, and he started Facebook, and he's a multi-gazillionaire. So that obviously shows that you don't need a college degree. That's not the lesson, friend. That's not the lesson. Notice Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard. That implies a lot before that. And then notice there was a whole lot of timing associated with that. Dropping out of college is not the lesson, unless it is. So be careful about the stories that we tell, because when we only tell the unusual stories and we only tell the way out of the normal experience stories, then for the next generation, those become the stories that they measure things against. And that's not the right solution. So if you're going to tell the stories of, you know what, I spent 20 years in the gutter and destroyed every aspect of my life, harmed every relationship whatsoever, and Jesus saved me from that. Praise God. Let's tell those stories. But let's make that 1 out of 10. Because for every person like that Jesus saves, there's a whole lot of other people that wind up just with their lives in ruin, but you never see them when you're part of a society and a community that's happy and healthy and everyone gets along with one another and everything's just simple and smooth and successful. Then all of a sudden you wind up on the other side of town and you see the dysfunction that exists because of broken lives and stupid decisions and terrible culture, and you realize, oh, wow. I thought growing up that the functional relationships and the functional society that I lived in, I didn't think about that because I was like the fish who was asked what water is. That was just what surrounded me. But now I see that that's to be appreciated and to be prioritized. And as I start to get older, I see that, you know what, it's a good thing I didn't lose 20 years to debauchery, because once you lose 20 years of debauchery, you don't get it back. Be proactive about life. Be proactive about money. Be proactive about things, and resolve to do it the hard way. Resolve to pay the extra money. Resolve to have it. Resolve to feed the ticket. Resolve to just go and do it. Don't be the person who is going to Disney and thinks I'm going to park around the corner at the grocery store. Just pay the $40 for parking. Be the person who spends the money. And if you can't afford to go to Disney, don't go to Disney. But if you're going to go to Disney, go to Disney. There's a dozen stories that try to make it true, but I feel it's my responsibility as somebody who acted that way in the past, who tried to do everything last minute and enjoyed the fun of it and the excitement, and then realized, you know what, if you spend your entire life battling the systems that exist, what do you have to show for it? It's much better to accept the world the way it is and just follow the rules, follow the system. And then when it's appropriate to break a rule, break it carefully and advisedly. If you are, one more example, I think about my children. We can appreciate some things about those who break the rules. There are rules that need to be broken. If you're someone who follows the rules the vast majority of the time, and you come across a rule that needs to be broken, and you break it, your breaking of that rule is going to be effective, probably effective for change. But if you're someone who just breaks all the rules, and then you break the rule that needs to be broken, you're probably not going to get any kind of audience for the change that you want to see in the world. It's so obvious to me as a father. And now I look back at myself and I see, wow, there were times in my life where I just had fun breaking the rules, and there were times in my life where I followed them. And I get way better results when I follow the rules the vast majority of the time, and then just carefully break the one that needs to be broken. I get much better results that way. I think I have shared with you what I wanted to share with you. Everywhere in life, be proactive. Do the things that need to be done long before they need to be done. Buy the insurance policy before the storm is on the horizon. Buy the insurance policy, buy the life insurance policy before you go to the doctor. Go out and start the exercise plan before you have the heart attack. Renew the passport 2 years before you need it. Feed the meter. Don't pay the ticket. These are the habits that pay off in life. These are the habits that lead to a wealthy life. These are the habits that lead to successful businesses, lead to successful families. These are the habits that lead to successful people. And as you get older and you start to reap the benefits of these changes in habits, you acquire more and more power, more and more influence, and more prestige. And then you can actually change the things in life that need to be changed. If you ignore these fundamental habits, you're always broke. You're always in debt. You're always late. You're always scrambling to go and pay the ticket. You're always fighting with the person to try to get the document at last minute. If you do that stuff, you wind up becoming impotent. You don't have power. You don't have authority. You don't have influence. You can't change things. And you're going to spend the rest of your life frustrated by all the things that are wrong that should be changed. And you can't do nothing about it. That's a pretty frustrating place to be in life. It's frustrating to grow older, to start to have the wisdom of age and not to have the resources that you should have because you were proactive when you were young. Be proactive. Take responsibility for all things. That is the cornerstone habit of life success, relationship success, and financial success. Be proactive. It's always cheaper to feed the meter than to pay the ticket.